All right, Jordan Peterson has stated, and this was back in 2018 when he was giving a talk at Cambridge University to a group of students that ultimately asked a very interesting question regarding the climate. Now, I'm surprised that this statement out of Peterson did not get bigger and more controversial. I've known about it for quite some time, and I finally decided, hey, let's talk about this. Let's do a bit of a segment, because there are a number of things within this that are huge wake-up calls for a lot of people, but at the same time reveal some very interesting stuff with regards to the politics of climate change. Now, in this talk, where ultimately I'm going to show you a clip and we're going to kind of go through a number of the things that Peterson says here. Now, one of the things that's most interesting about this to me is I've been doing a lot of research on the climate for a lot of years. I'm talking about digging into the papers, digging into the research, really sifting through a ton of the stuff over the past 10 years, including going back and looking at all the data that's been available for many years prior to that. And when you do that, you start to pull together a very different story than what you might hear out of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, who are pushing ideas that, while are somewhat important when you really sift through the entire environmental discussion, at the same time they're extremely inaccurate and are guiding people down an incorrect path of understanding what's going on. And this is very, very important, as we've stated for a lot of years. If we don't understand where we're actually at as humanity with a number of the issues that play out in our world, including even the political spectrum, then we don't actually know how to move forward. And I'm not surprised that someone like Peterson, who does take a very intellectual approach to this, identified very quickly in his time at the UN, spending 2 years looking through all of this data, really, being part of an ecological committee, he came to the same conclusions that myself and many other people out there. This is not something that only a small group of people believe that they're lying about the climate and la-da-da-da-da. There's a ginormous group of people, scientists, intellectuals, random people who look at the data and understand, hey, there's something going on here with what is being talked about with climate change that isn't accurate. So let's watch this clip, and then we'll start diving through a couple of the things that he says in particular.
Drought, flooding, and ocean acidification, unanticipated for 65 million years, all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development, and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that will unite us that's not going to unite us.
So interestingly enough, it's a catastrophic mess, he says in one sentence, and then he follows that up with, it's very difficult to separate the politics from the actual facts. And this is exactly what we've found for a very long time, as we've reported on this issue, as one of the leaders in the space of people willing to talk about this subject, which is a very difficult subject to talk about given how politicized it is. But ultimately, it's like you realize you can present information to somebody, and what happens is they fall into one of two camps. If you do not agree with climate change, you are automatically someone who is pushing fossil fuels. You are someone who has been misled by fossil fuel science. This is probably the laziest, most ridiculous argument to any form of real, observation of what's going on with the climate that I've ever heard. And it's one that comes up a lot because people have a very difficult time with the idea that it isn't about sides, it's about neutrality. It's about seeing what is actually going on aside from the politics, aside from how it needs to match my narrative, aside from how it needs to match myself as an activist, right? Like people tell me all the time, hey, Joe, you're a great activist. You're one of the people that's fighting for a lot of different things and la-da-da-da. And I say, you know what? I don't really identify as an activist. I simply look at what's going on and I see things for what they are, and I'm willing to shift my perceptions when I see the truth or when I see new data or when I see things as they adjust. And that's how I've always been. I don't get into this idea that, hey, I'm an activist, therefore I must look like this, I must sound like this, I must act like this, I must interpret information like this. And I see this happen to a lot of people, and this is why I say all the time, personal development, personal transformation, consciousness, all this stuff is absolutely paramount when looking at our current events. Our current events tell us who we are as individuals and people. Keeping them separate and just putting politics over here and personal transformation over here is not going to get us to understand what's truly going on here. And being able to take a step back out of all of the narratives and beliefs that we've accepted over the social engineering and conditioning of the media for the past while, and looking at what's actually going on with the climate is the only thing that's going to get us looking forward. Because the reality of the situation is the science says something completely different from what the politics says, and people are convinced that what the politics says is actually the science when it's not. In fact, scientists have long said in this particular issue that they are completely unheard in the media, meaning the media is talking about things and the scientists have actually done protests saying what you're saying in the media, what the politicians are saying, is not the data we've provided. A very important issue to be looking at properly.
I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the claims, the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now.
Okay, perfect point, and something, again, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about on CTV, we've talked about on articles that we've written for the past 10 years. We've always talked about this idea that the data projections that we've even talked about as being formulated by the IPCC in the past, knowing that they knew that they were false data. The systems, the mechanics of this stuff is false. I've spoken to people like Greg Braden, who advised the UN. Him and Bruce Lipton at one point went to the UN because the UN eventually got to a point where they said, you know what, enough's enough. We realized that the models we have to predict climate change are completely false. So they went to two other people who were looking at it from a much more holistic perspective and brought them in and said, what do we do about this? And Braden went to them and said, well, your models and what's actually happening with climate change and what you're predicting with this CO2 stuff is completely false. And they said, we know that now. And so they ended up having a conversation looking at it in a much different way. And what we've always talked about is this idea that when you are looking at data that's faulty and you keep hearing these 10-year predictions or these 11-year predictions where it's like, oh, the planet is going to reach an irreplaceable point in the next 10 or 11 years. Well, hold on a second. I remember hearing that way back when I was first starting CE, and here we are 10 years later, and now what they're saying is we only have 10 years to turn things around. We only have 10 years. And why is that? Because at that moment, when they're making that prediction based on data that they're trying to create as a system to understand what's happening, data that only looks at one of, say, 5 potential factors that are in creating the climate situation we have out there, the problem is you have all these other factors you're not measuring. And so when these other factors come into play, you end up with faulty data that's proven faulty year after year after year after year. And so you start to realize, just as Peterson is saying in this particular thing, that most of what we've heard over the past 10 years or more about the climate is not accurate, and it never has been. And when year after year, the actual temperatures show, hey, it didn't change quite as much as we thought, or hey, you know what, things are actually kind of balancing out a lot better than we thought. That's not really talked about. Nobody really wants to, bring that into the equation. Instead, they just go back to the same fear narrative. Now we only have 10 years. Now we're at that point where we only have 10 years. And it just keeps, repeating cycle over and over and over again.
So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. There's like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize.
Just got to point out there, again, when you apply personal transformation, simple stuff about, hey, if I want to kind of create a plan, a set of goals or something, you know, Peterson's talking about here, it's like, you can't just say, oh, well, here's 200 things that we're going to do here in current events in the politics world. It's like, well, hold on a second. That doesn't apply to how humans can actually function and actually do things, i.e. when you bring together personal transformation and current events into one picture, you can discuss it, much like Peterson is saying here, where it actually has meaning, it actually has value, because instead of creating political policy, which is ultimately all the millennial goals of the UN really are, is about pushing political agendas, when you actually move out of that frame of thinking and move into, hold on a second, what's actually in my heart, you start getting a very different picture. Let's go back to the video.